Alright, you guys, we are back with Chapter 3 of Discriminating Taste, Episode 2 Tom Yum Soup by Jenanegans 1207. The room is filled with the kind of tense silence that cannot be broken as they all crowd around the desk and stare at the statistics pulled up on the computer screen before them. Kotaro had nearly sprinted into the PR office this morning, dragging Hanaku and Hiroto over to his desk before he even said good morning to them. They'd come with little protest, staring wide-eyed at the screen as he pulled up the information he wanted to show them. And then they just stood there, silently staring at the screen, as if they were all waiting for something to pop up and say that this was part of some elaborate prank. It had been nearly 3 minutes of silence, and so far, the only thing that had happened was that the numbers they were staring at continued to tick up slowly. Finally, Hanaku is the one to break the silence. She takes in a breath that's audible in the still silence of the room and then says, her voice just above a hoarse whisper, "Am I reading that right?" She glances over to Hiroto and Kotaro for confirmation. "Does that really have a comma in it?" And it does. It really does. Kotaro hadn't been able to believe it himself, honestly. When he'd woken up to check the statistics of their first cooking episode, he'd expected maybe a couple hundred views at best. The whole idea had been sort of a last-minute scramble, and there hadn't been time to properly market the idea at all. He'd posted about it on the company's social media pages, but those rarely got traction on the best of days. Honestly, he's not sure how anyone really heard about the cooking show at all, but he's left to assume that one person, or maybe two, three at most, stumbled upon it accidentally, and then word of mouth spread from there. Because the number on the screen definitely has a comma. There were over 300,000 views on the first episode, the number continuing to increase steadily, but slowly as they all stared at it, open-mouthed and lost for words. It does. Kotaro finally confirms after a moment, his jaw practically sore from sitting on the ground all morning. And the reviews. He finally moves from where he's been frozen this entire time, leaning forward to click on a different tab. Are all good. Everyone who watched it loved it. It had been like a dream, sifting through the comments this morning and reading what everyone had to say about it. They loved the idea. They loved Dynamite and Deku's dynamic, and they appreciated how well Dynamite managed to teach. For what an absolutely far-fetched and absurd idea it had been to start with, it appeared to be working, because people were only saying good things about Dynamite, and honestly, Kotaro thinks that must be the first time in his entire career that he had seen so many good things about the hero. He'd spent the morning considering pinching himself or purposefully walking into a door just to see if he was really awake. For all he knew, Bakugo had knocked him out after he had suggested the idea, and this was all an elaborate dream as he slept peacefully in a hospital bed. Bakugo's grace, or more likely Midoriya's interference, the only thing keeping him alive. Hiroto finally seems to shake himself back to reality too, as he braces a hand on the desk and leans forward to scan the comments that are still flooding in as they stare. They loved it? Yeah. Kotaro points out a few comments that stuck out to him, and Hiroto's eyebrows raise so high they can barely be seen anymore as he scans them. And you really didn't make this all up? Hiroto asks after a moment, glancing up at Kotaro. Honestly, more than anything else, Kotaro appreciates the dedication that Hiroto thinks he has to this job. And he is dedicated to his job, clearly willing to do what it takes to get his job done. But even with that dedication, he wouldn't go to the effort to make hundreds of accounts, come up with hundreds of individual comments, and program a bunch of bots to watch the video on repeat. He's not even sure he would know how to do that last part. It's all genuine, he answers, just as blown away as his coworkers, despite the fact that he's had this information for a few hours longer than them. I haven't done anything. Truthfully, Kotaro wasn't sure how long it was going to take him to believe what he was seeing. Each time the number increased, it became even more unbelievable that this was actually happening. He had agreed to try, to give it his best shot, but he hadn't expected it to work, and certainly not so instantaneously. The numbers are only going to increase with each episode, Hanaku points out after a moment. You realize that, right? If we do proper marketing for it and people keep talking about it, it's only going to grow from here. And that is something Kotaro definitely can't wrap his head around. He hadn't even been expecting to reach these kind of numbers by the end. Honestly, Even though he'd been told to make 6 episodes of the cooking show, Kotaro had expected it to fizzle out after 2 or 3. Clearly not a profitable endeavor that wasn't worth the effort to continue pursuing. He had expected Michael to shrug when Kotaro showed him the data and throw out some variation of, "At least we tried our best," before allowing the idea to die. By then, the stream would have blown over anyways, and whatever anger some of the public had towards the two pro heroes would be resolved or forgotten. But this all but sealed all of their fates. There was no way that Michael was going to look at these numbers and not require the full 6 weeks. That meant that Kotaro was going to be spending a night in Bakugo's kitchen every week for the next 5 weeks. He was going to go toe to toe with imminent death on a weekly basis, and each time he faced it, the odds of Bakugo actually killing him probably increased. It might only be in a marginal increase, but any increase was a chance that Kotaro wasn't particularly thrilled about taking. Except now, instead of being a black mark that smudges his career permanently, he was standing on the precipice of something that could make his career, catapulting him to the top of the PR game and leaving him in a nearly undefeatable position. He no longer has the option of packing those cardboard boxes and hanging his head as he slipped out the back door unnoticed by anyone. He had started this, so now he had to finish it. The change is immediate. It's subtle, sure, barely even noticeable if Katsuki chooses to overlook it. And he does, most of the time, but it's there whenever he does choose to look, and he doesn't know how to feel about it. His gut reaction is to be repulsed by it, but he's not entirely sure why. For all the years they had been pro heroes, both Katsuki and Izuku had gotten their fair share of fan mail. It probably had a lot to do with the fact that their class was one of the most well-known classes in UA history, and they had participated in a war before they'd even had their official hero licenses. Sometimes, Katsuki chooses to overlook that as well. Regardless, the idea of getting fan mail is far from a new concept to Katsuki. Just like it's normal for them to get stopped on the street as people request to take pictures with them or congratulate them on their most recent win. When Katsuki had decided to be a hero, he hadn't thought about much more than the taste of victory on his tongue as he stood triumphant over the enemy. He hadn't really thought about becoming a public figure, a household name, someone for little kids to look up to. It's silly to think that he hadn't realized this aspect of his future, considering he had been that little kid looking up to All Might and always hoping to pass him by happenstance on the street so he could tell All Might just how impressed he was. But somehow, the idea had never occurred to him that other people would feel that way about him. In the end, he'd gotten used to it as best as he was ever going to get used to it. He'd learned to swallow down the small amount of discomfort that still came with being recognized, and managed to put on the closest thing he had to a smile whenever people tried to interact with him. But now that things have shifted, even if they're only a few degrees to the left, he was thrust back into that initial feeling of unease and discomfort. Most people who saw him and Izuku strolling the street still just wanted pictures with them or yelled encouraging words as they passed by. There were always the few people who were wearing their merch, smiling broadly as they pointed to their shirts or hoodie. It seemed mostly normal, until one of the people who stopped them placed her hand on Katsuki's forearm before he could slip away. "I want you to know that I followed your katsura recipe," she said earnestly, with a warm smile on her face. Katsuki freezes in a spot, but out of the corner of his eye he can see Izuku's wide eyes and matching smile. "It was absolutely delicious." "Isn't it great?" Izuku jumps into the conversation with that level of excitement he's known for, practically vibrating at Katsuki's side with something Katsuki has come to recognize as pride. He only vibrates on this particular wavelength when he's especially proud of something, or in this case, someone. That someone, of course, being Katsuki. It makes the whole situation more uncomfortable. "Kachan has always made my favorite katsuran." The woman is nodding as she looks at Izuku, her hand practically burning through Katsuki's forearm. "I've made katsuran for years, but the changes you suggested..." She turns her warm gaze back on Katsuki, and he doesn't know what to say or how to respond. we're both super easy to make and very tasty. My whole family loved it. I can't wait to try all of your other recipes. Katsuki opens his mouth, not sure what to say other than a simple thanks. But that seems to be all the woman needs because she beams at him, squeezes his arm once, in what is obviously meant to be a fond gesture, and then she takes her leave, waving at Izuku as she goes. There's a long moment where Katsuki continues to stare at the woman for no reason, other than the desire to avoid making the eye contact that Izuku is clearly waiting for. He can feel it, the way Izuku's proud gaze is burning into the side of his face, the way Izuku continues to vibrate with the same pride next to him. He doesn't have to turn to Izuku to know what he's going to say, but he also knows that it's going to be impossible to avoid. Katsuki takes a deep breath and lets it out slowly before turning to face Izuku. "See?" is all Izuku says to start, and Katsuki resists the urge to roll his eyes or sneer. Izuku huffs out a quiet laugh and tacks more onto the end, though Katsuki isn't sure he actually wants that. "People other than me love your cooking." "She didn't try my cooking," Katsuki points out as he sets off again, knowing that Izuku will inevitably fall into step with him the way he has their entire lives. "She followed my recipe. It's not the same thing." "It's essentially the same thing." Izuku, true to form, is entirely unbothered by Katsuki being contrary. He simply smiles through it and brushes it off as if Katsuki hadn't said it at all. It was one of Izuku's most well-honed skills at this point in their lives. And I guarantee she's not the only one. Did you hear about the numbers the first episode got? The answer to that question is sort of. Because Katsuki and Izuku had both been copied in on an email from Kotaro where he was sending the updated information to Michael. So Katsuki had every ability to be informed of the numbers. He just chose not to be. He hadn't even opened the damn email, honestly. He'd read the title of it, seen who was included in the recipients, and deleted it without even a moment's consideration of reading it. The truth was, he didn't give a shit. He didn't have any choice about making the rest of these episodes. Michael had ordered a strict 6 weeks, and Katsuki had agreed. Even if it had been begrudging, it had also been binding. So whether the show was a huge success or a huge flop didn't impact the next 5 weeks of Katsuki's life. "It's not like that shit matters," he says to Izuku instead of actually answering his question. But he knows that Izuku will deduce the answer from just those words. He's always been annoyingly observant, especially when it came to Katsuki. "Of course it does," Izuku replies on the tail end of a sigh, shaking his head in a way that is both fond and exasperated. This exact conversation is new, but the tone of it is familiar to both of them. They slip into their roles easily and without hesitation. Izuku fighting for Katsuki to see the value in something that he had dismissed before even considering it. "You could really make a difference in people's lives with this." "I already make a difference in people's lives," Katsuki spits back, a little irritated at the concept. "By fighting off villains and keeping their houses safe. There's a million cooking videos on the internet. There aren't a million heroes saving the day." Izuku inclines his head in acknowledgement of Katsuki's statement, but Katsuki knows that's not the end of it. It would be a good argument to use on literally anyone other than Izuku. But since Izuku is, in essence, the only hero that is better than Katsuki, it almost nullifies the statement, because Izuku is out there making that same difference in people's lives. He understands Katsuki's point and where he's coming from, but he's also such a fucking goody two-shoes that he is constantly going above and beyond to try and aid people more than he already does. If going the extra mile is above and beyond, Izuku goes the extra 10 miles just because that's who he is as a person. So of course, he would see this as something additional that's aiding the community they serve. Something they should be devoting their time to. It's not like the fights, training, paperwork, and cleanup leave them much free time. But Izuku has somehow always managed to stretch the number of hours in a day to unfathomable levels, making it so that he could get more done in less time. Katsuki had been at his side for years now, and he still didn't have a single idea how the damn nerd managed to do it. "I know you already do a lot for the city," Izuku says in a way that is clearly meant to placate. If it were anyone else, Katsuki would have their head for being a condescending asshole, but he knows that Izuku doesn't mean it that way. It still ruffles his feathers just a little as he shoots Izuku a sharp look. "But this really could have the impact Michael and Kotaro want. You could be making a day-to-day impact on people's lives, and I personally think that's really cool." "Of course you do," Katsuki grumbles, stepping closer to Izuku to allow them to sneak around a group of people waiting for the bus. "You think everything's cool, that's why you keep those shitty notebooks." This time, it's Izuku who rolls his eyes. "I'm going to ignore that." "How generous of you." Katsuki bites back, but it doesn't land. Nothing snide or snarky he says to Izuku ever lands anymore. They had long since moved past the point in their relationship where their words were covered with actual barbs or sharpened to hurt. Now everything they said was in good nature or taken with a grain of salt. Katsuki didn't have the same hatred for Izuku that he'd had when they were younger. He didn't feel that same inferiority, even though he now knew with absolute certainty that Izuku was better than him. "I just think it's going to be really good," Izuku points out again, as if he hadn't already made this point 5 minutes ago. "I think you should keep doing it." "I don't have a fucking choice," Katsuki retorts. Michael's word is absolute, the bastard. "You do have a choice," Izuku replies breezily, catching Katsuki's sleeve to tug out of the way of some joggers. "After the 6 weeks is up, you get to decide." "Ha!" Katsuki barks, shaking his head, shaking Izuku's hand off of his sleeve. "You think I'm gonna keep doing this when I'm no longer forced to? That's fucking hilarious, Deku." Izuku shakes his head again, but his smile still hasn't dulled. There's something in his eyes that Katsuki doesn't like it when he glances over at him. It's the look he has when he knows something that Katsuki doesn't, or when he's predicting something Katsuki's going to do. "I think you'll be surprised," is all he says. The interesting thing about Michael's office is that it looks like it should be warm and welcoming, but somehow there's always a little bit of a cold chill to it. It's decorated with plants and pictures. There are books, other than scholarly ones, filling the shelves that sit behind his desk. It looks like it belongs to someone with personality, and isn't just a cold room devoid of any feeling. And yet, every time Izuku steps into it, he feels like he's unable to fully relax. "Deku," Michael greets, glancing up briefly from the paper he's filling out as his door opens. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Izuku steps into the room and mumbles some sort of acknowledgement as he waits for Michael to finish up what he's doing. There are 2 chairs opposite of his desk, but he doesn't dare sit in them without invitation, feeling as if it would somehow be extremely rude to do so. Michael is actually very kind, and Izuku likes him a lot, but he wears the air of a boss well, and it leaves little to no room for challenging him or making any sort of misstep. It has made him extremely successful, and is the reason he's the head of the agency that houses the majority of the top-tier heroes. He takes his job seriously, and he expects his heroes to do the same. But he's never been unkind or unfair in anything he's ever asked them to do. Of course, Katsuki would disagree vehemently, but that's because he hasn't learned the difference between something being unfair and something just being inconvenient for him personally. Just because he hates doing some of the things Michael asks them to do, doesn't mean Michael is out of line by asking them to do those things. The longer they've been pro-heroes, the more Izuku has been gifted the ability to watch Katsuki grow and develop. When they had first started as heroes at the agency, Katsuki would have raised hell for any and every task he didn't personally like. and that was most of them, to say the least. Now he would make a snide comment or two, but otherwise would bite his tongue. At the very least, now he would suck it up and complete whatever task they'd been handed, even if he complained through the whole thing. There were times in their past when had exactly zero intention of ever following through on anything, and Izuku had to all but beg him to do it. Okay, Michael sets down the pen he had been holding and turns his gaze up to Izuku. It snaps Izuku back to the present as he watches Michael offer him a warmer smile and greets him again. Hello. Hi, Izuku replies, feeling stupid as he does so. That's one thing he's never gotten the hang of as he's grown up. Talking to people he respects. He's still an incoherent mess around the other pro heroes, and he trips over his words nearly every time he tries to talk to Michael. It's absolutely and completely lost on him that he's the number one pro hero, honestly. He feels like the 15-year-old who was struggling to gain control of his quirk and desperately trying not to be left behind by his amazing classmates. He still feels like the kid who kept notebooks full of info on the pro heroes because he idolized them more than anyone else. It hadn't sunk in at all that he was one of them now, and that other people looked up to him the way he looked up to others. He was fairly certain at this point that he would never get used to that. I'm sorry you have to stop in so late in the day, Michael begins, graciously overlooking how silly Izuku must sound. It makes Izuku want to let out a sigh of relief. But there is something I wanted to talk to you about. Of course, Izuku agrees, finally taking a seat as Michael gestures to it. In truth, he has no idea what Michael could want. The first episode of the cooking show had gone well, and Izuku had been copied in on multiple emails over the last few days between Michael and both his and Katsuki's PR teams. His was now getting some input since he was now officially part of the whole thing, but it was still driven by Kotaro, and there didn't seem to be anything amiss. It was wildly unexpected how well the first episode had done. But other than that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Katsuki continued to complain about it every time he saw a new email in his inbox, or realized he was one day closer to having to film a new episode. But those fell well within the realms of things that Izuku had expected. His hero work had been going well too. He had managed to close a case that had been plaguing the agency for months a few days ago. But Michael had already complimented him on that, so he didn't think this meeting could be related to that either. So, instead of spending all of his time guessing and working himself into more and more anxiety, he chose to sit quietly in the chair opposite of Michael and wait for him to explain. Michael, luckily, has always been a man who gets right to the point. It's perhaps the only good thing that Katsuki has ever said about him. I was reviewing the previous episode of Discriminating Taste. Michael begins, smiling a little at the name, and it almost makes Izuku want to smile too. And I realized that you had mentioned a playlist. Oh. This is not how Izuku expected this to go, and certainly not how he would have liked it to go. Technically, it had been Katsuki who mentioned the playlist, not Izuku, and that was a very important distinction because Izuku had no intent of sharing that playlist with anyone. It was something he played whenever he was over at Katsuki's and cooking, but usually, in those instances, Katsuki was busy finishing up paperwork or taking a shower. Izuku was aware of the fact that Katsuki knew he had a cooking playlist. He'd come in at the tail end of Izuku's cooking before, which was the proper moment to see him singing and dancing around Katsuki's kitchen while he waited for the food to finish cooking, of course. It had been deeply embarrassing the first few times it had happened, but then Katsuki hadn't made any more fun of him than usual, and Izuku had learned to let go of that embarrassment. Still, that didn't mean that he was suddenly ready or willing to share the playlist with other people. It was one thing to share it with Katsuki. It was another to make it entirely public and to let everyone see what kind of things he wanted to listen to. Though, truthfully, it wasn't the songs that were embarrassing. It was the mental image that he knew they would all paint of him in the kitchen now that Katsuki had shared how he liked to bop around the kitchen to his music. But if this conversation was heading the way he thought it was heading, he wasn't about to be given much of a choice in whether he would like to share that playlist or not. As Katsuki has said, Michael's word is absolute. And I was reviewing the comments on the video. Michael continues, seemingly unaware of the distress this subject has put Izuku into. And there are a large number of people requesting to have access to your playlist. Ever since becoming a well-known hero, Izuku had made it a habit to keep as much of his life secret as possible. Most of it was due to the fact that he still didn't think of himself as a celebrity, so he tried to maintain that sense of normalcy at all costs. The rest of it was because the media loved to take things he said and did and ran away with them, drawing conclusions that couldn't be further from the truth. So, he'd never shared any of his music tastes, or taste for anything, really. Yes, I believe I talked to Kotaro about that. Izuku begins, only to be cut off by Michael. Yes, I've also talked to Kotaro about it. Michael replies smoothly, and now there's a particular glint in his eyes that suggests that he knows exactly how much Izuku is going to dislike what he's asking for, but he's asking for it anyways. And suddenly, Izuku finds himself in a position where he understands Katsuki a lot more than usual. Because he absolutely hates everything about this situation, but he understands where Michael is coming from. Their goal is to get more people to view the show and to make them more personable and likable to the public. While the latter goals are more specifically tailored to Katsuki, it could never hurt to try and bolster his own popularity too. So now he must face the fact that what Michael is asking him isn't strictly unfair, even, even if Izuku thinks he'd rather do just about anything else. I understand. He forces himself to reply, swallowing around a lump in his throat. I'll send the link over to Kotaro. Michael's smile isn't cruel, but it's still something Izuku doesn't want to look at any longer. Thank you. They make a brief small talk after that, and then Izuku is finally dismissed. He could change his playlist before he sends it to Kotaro, could take out the songs that are already echoing in the back of his mind while he thinks about it, but that wouldn't be authentic. And if he's going to do this, he's going to do it genuinely. Maybe the general public will be just as uninterested as Katsuki. Maybe they won't dig into the songs or try to read into anything. It's certainly a long shot, but it's the hope Izuku holds onto as he pulls out his phone and sends the link over to Kotaro before he has a chance to chicken out at all. This time, setting up the equipment is a quick and easy process. Everyone has been to Bakugo's flat before. They've already gone through the trouble of finding outlets and determining the perfect camera angle. There were pages upon pages of notes on both of those subjects that had been written, so that they could repeat their setup every single time they came, even if someone new had to step in. The apartment feels more familiar to Kotaro now, too, even though he's only been here once. He had been so intimidated the first time he'd come in that he'd been able to recognize the warmth and welcoming sensation, but he hadn't been able to experience it. He remembers having the revelation that Bakugo and Midoriya were just two people, and he was inside one of their homes, the way he would be inside anyone else's home. But he'd been 2 seconds away from passing out the entire time, that it hadn't really hit him. It doesn't fully hit him this time either, but he isn't as terrified as before. There's a sort of comfort to Bakugo's apartment, and he feels a sense of ease as he kicks his shoes off inside the door. He walks through the place easily, navigating around things. He even considers pausing to look at what pictures Bakugo has framed, but decides that's for a day when he's feeling braver than today. He was doing good today, by just navigating the place on his own. He didn't want to press his luck. The lighting, cu- the lighting crew moved around Bakugo's apartment with ease now, plugging in and adjusting lights, shifting stuff on the counter to make sure that there wasn't anything reflective in the way. They'd had to make some adjustments for all the stainless steel Bakugo had in his flat, but even that seemed to be going quickly this time too. Just like last time, both Bakugo and Midoriya are already in the kitchen when they arrive. Midoriya, seated with a head propped in his hand while Bakugo sorts through the ingredients that had been dropped off by Kotaro earlier in the day. Bakugo had taken his sweet time in requesting his ingredients this week, and Kotaro wanted to believe that it was because he hadn't settled on what kind of dish he was going to make, but deep inside he assumed it was some sort of retaliation at the fact that he was being made to do this. He had emailed the recipe to Kotaro just minutes before the deadline, giving Kotaro only one morning to do the shopping and the delivery. He had been lucky that all the ingredients had been available and in stock at the first store he'd gone to. If he had gone to make more than one trip, he probably wouldn't have made his own deadline. It's something he needs to talk to Bakugo about. Through email. Tomorrow. Maybe Sunday. All set, one of the lighting crew members calls, twisting one last dial that means absolutely nothing to Kotaro. Everyone turns to glance over at them, Bakugo and Midoriya included, but they don't seem to wilt under the pressure at all. They just smile and shoot a thumbs up towards the two pro heroes, taking a step back to get out of the camera frame. Kotaro is watching as their foot catches on one of the lighting cords. They seem to notice the feeling of the cord immediately, shifting their weight back onto the other foot in a desperate attempt to not pull out the cord. It sends them tipping off balance immediately, and Kotaro rushes forward to catch them by the shoulder, holding them steady as they manage to get their feet back underneath them. "Are you alright?" he asks after the commotion has died down, and they're starting to take back their own weight instead of leaning so heavily on him. "Yes." They turn a beaming smile up at him once they've gotten their footing again. "Thank you so much." "Oh, right." Kotaro feels like he's stumbling over his words suddenly, not used to being the center of anyone's attention. The whole point of PR was to make people pay attention to someone else. "Of course, just be careful." The way they laugh is light and airy as they finally step properly over the cord and retreat to where they're supposed to be. "I will be." And just like that, the moment is over. That is, until Kotaro glances over to see Midoriya staring at him with a warm smile and an unreadable expression in his eyes. Kotaro can't place it, but it makes him feel like he has to look away. "Right," Kotaro says again, drawing the attention in the room to him briefly. He clears his throat. "Well, I believe everything is set up. Are you ready to get started?" "I was ready before you assholes got here," Bakugo replies, only to be whacked in the arm by Midoriya, the hit accompanied by a withering look. Bakugo scoffs and rolls his eyes. "Ready," he says instead, shooting a look at Midoriya. Midoriya stares at him for a moment longer, as if trying to emphasize an unspoken point, and then turns to look back at the rest of the crew. "Ready." The same sense of fate settles around Kotaro as he calls out the countdown. He barely has a chance to wonder what's in store for him this time. The episode isn't live streamed, but there's still a bunch of people in the chat before the episode even begins. There's a buzz that fills the chat as the title to the episode loads and the screen starts to shift. Discriminating Taste. Cooking with Dynamite. Episode 2. Tom Yum Soup. Follow along with Dynamite's recipe here. Listen to Deku's playlist here. Just like the first episode, when the screen fades from black, Dynamite is standing behind the kitchen counter with a bunch of ingredients spread out in front of him. Deku is seated in the same spot as last time, the same bright smile on his face. They both look at ease, as if this is a normal place for them to be, next to each other in the privacy of Dynamite's house. The chat is already alive with comments before anyone even starts to speak. "Thank you for joining us," Deku pipes up when the silence lasts for a beat too long, his smile never faltering as he slips into the moment. It's something he's known for in interviews, answering for Dynamite or cutting Dynamite off to redirect his answer into something more agreeable. It's something their fans have always loved. It's something their fan bases have always loved. And just like in every interview, Dynamite doesn't actually look put out to hear Deku doing it. "We were blown away by the support you guys gave us on the first episode, and we're really excited to be back here to film another episode for you." "Are we?" Dynamite quips, but there's a good-natured smirk on his lips that makes it lack any sort of bite. It's clear that Deku knows this because he just rolls his eyes in Dynamite's direction and answers, "Yes, we are." Dynamite huffs, but doesn't interrupt as Deku continues with, "We heard so many great stories of people trying to get Kachan's recipes and enjoying them. It's been really heartwarming to hear from all of you, and I'm so glad that you're enjoying the series so far." Okay. Dynamite cuts in, waving his hand dismissively. "Are they here to listen to you ramble or to see me cook?" "Why can't they be here for both?" Deku replies easily, shooting a sharp smile at Dynamite. "I'm capable of talking while you cook." Dynamite stares at him for a long second, and the tension in the room seems to grow. The chat immediately explodes with calls for Kotaro, a fan favorite that they had barely gotten to see enough of in the first episode. And even though nobody could confirm that he was there since he hadn't shown up on screen at all yet, the chat was certain that they could feel his brand of anxious energy seeping through the screen. And sure enough, when the tense staring lasted long enough, Kotaro appeared in the corner of the screen, having taken a few tentative steps forward. He held a hand out in front of him and seemed to be radiating the same sort of discomfort as he had in the first episode. "Can we please get to the cooking?" he asks, both terrified and exasperated at the same time. The chat immediately agrees that it's a relatable feeling when interacting with these two pro heroes specifically. Deku responds immediately, returning to his normal warm smile as he glances at Kotaro. "Of course, I'm sorry." "Oh," Dynamite says, his same tight smile in place as he turns back to the screen itself. "I'm supposed to announce something." "That's okay," Deku says immediately, even through the screen, the red in his cheeks is very visible. He flushes so dark, his freckles almost disappear completely. It's both endearing and impressive. "You were right, they're here for the cooking, so let's get to that." "And deny your fans what they want?" Dynamite sneers, and the chat immediately lights up, with people jumping to Deku's aid. They were practically begging for the link to your playlist last episode. Immediately, Deku buries his face in his hands as he mumbles something that is entirely unintelligible through both the screen and his hands. He hadn't gotten even the slightest bit red. The chat, however, has stopped coming to his defense, and instead shifted into continued demands for the playlist that had been mentioned. As soon as the last episode had aired, there had been a gathering of fans on Twitter and Tumblr talking about it and dissecting the little crumbs of their lives that had been dropped, and the biggest topic of scrutiny had been the elusive playlist that had been mentioned in passing. There were theories all over the place about what kind of music Deku would listen to, with heated arguments on whether he was a good dancer or the kind of person who danced around their kitchen so terribly it was endearing somehow, even if it was still embarrassing. Those seemed to be the two camps that everyone fell into. Nobody seemed to think he had the potential to be a mediocre dancer. There were arguments about how skilled he was in battle and how that surely had to translate to his dancing moves, and equal but opposite arguments about how awkward and easily flustered he was and how that also had to translate into his dancing. It was widely agreed upon that the fans would likely never know, because they couldn't imagine a situation in which Deku would ever demonstrate his dancing abilities for them. For being so kind and outgoing, he was pretty secretive about his personal life, which his fans tried to protect with as much ferocity as possible. They didn't like the idea of people prying into things he clearly tried to keep secret, so they tried to ask for as little as possible, which meant that the final decision on whether he was a good or awkward dancer would come from hearing the playlist. He had agreed last episode to consider sharing it so people didn't feel bad for asking for it. If it was music with good beats that were easy to dance to, he would be considered a good dancer. And if it were songs that reasonably should not be danced to, he would permanently be deemed as an awkward dancer unless he ever decided to prove them wrong. That's right. Dynamite is grinning at the camera now, clearly enjoying to the extent to which Deku's ears have turned red. His face is still buried in his hands, but it's assumed that his cheeks are equally aflame. The link to Deku's shitty playlist is in the description of this video, or that's what they've told me anyways. It is, Kotaro chimes in from off screen. So listen for yourself and thank your lucky fucking stars that you don't have to see his dancing. Dynamite remarks before picking up a knife and reaching for a cutting board. Okay, now let's get to some cooking. You're the worst. Deku finally emerges from behind his hands, scowling. You're the one who gave them the link. Dynamite shrugs, rearranging a few ingredients. Should have told him to fuck off if he didn't want to share it. You know I could never do that. Deku cries, looking affronted at the implication. Dynamite slices into a package and starts dumping things onto the cutting board. I know that you're a wimp. It's called being a nice person, Deku snaps. You should try it sometime, Kachan. Before the chat even has the chance to react, the fans in general love the way Deku and Dynamite are always taking friendly shots at each other. There's something so enticing about it. Dynamite just smirks and replies with a simple pass. Deku sighs and crosses his arms over his chest, leaning back on the stool he's seated on. It looks like a very precarious position, but he doesn't seem to lose balance at all. Instead, he just sits there, perfectly stable, pouting at the camera. Fine, just tell us what you're cooking, he says finally. And so, Dynamite does. Or tries to, anyway. But the moment he reaches for the first ingredient, Deku is sitting upright in his seat, leaning across the counter towards Dynamite. Kachan, aren't you forgetting something? Deku asks pointedly, staring at Dynamite with a displeased expression. The hell could I be forgetting? Dynamite asks, glancing around the counter. I checked all the ingredients beforehand. Not the ingredients, Deku points out, and the chat is suddenly exploding with ideas, clearly making the jump to Deku's meaning much faster than Dynamite had. If you have something to say, Dynamite grumbles, turning to face Deku. Just fucking say it. Your apron! Deku cries, throwing his hands up in the air before gesturing at Dynamite's exposed button-up shirt. You're not wearing the apron I got you! Oh, Dynamite says as he glances around his kitchen as if he had genuinely forgotten about the apron. I don't know where it is. Deku leans back into the seat of his chair, hands gripping the edge of the countertop, not tightly, not out of anger, but it almost looks like he's using them to hold himself steady in his chair as he leans even further back to glance around Dynamite, inspecting the kitchen himself. The fans are doing the same, comments flying into the chat about how nobody sees even a hint of the apron in the background. No pop of green, no edge of it hanging somewhere off screen. It's collectively agreed upon that the apron is nowhere to be found in the kitchen. You don't know where it is? Deku repeats. Or you got rid of it because you didn't want to wear it. Listen, Deku. Dynamite sends him a disapproving look. I might be an asshole, but I'm not that big of an asshole. I didn't get rid of the damn thing. He pauses mid-sentence, a thought clearly occurring to him. Hold on, I know where it is. And then, without any preamble whatsoever, Dynamite strides off screen. Deku watches him go, eyebrows raising as he tracks Dynamite's route through his flat. He clearly knows the layout well because he suddenly breaks into a big grin when he realizes where Dynamite is, hauling himself back up to sit properly in his chair. His smile only grows, the edges turning a little smug as Dynamite finally returns back on screen, the offending apron in his hand. "Kachan," Deku says, leaning forward a little as Dynamite passes behind him. "Did you wash my apron?" There's a dusting of pink across Dynamite's cheek at the question. "Shut up, nerd. It was gross after the last episode. I needed to clean it." "That's very thoughtful of you," Deku replies, smiling more genuinely now. "Shut the hell up," Dynamite says, slipping the apron over his head. "I have a cooking show to host." Deku laughs warmly, the sound everyone is familiar with, even if it has a bit more depth to it now. It sounds more real, more heartfelt. The chat loves it immediately and is already rejoicing in the return of the apron, calling for it to be a permanent staple to every future episode. "Sorry, Kachan." Deku sinks his head back into his hand, a position that seems to be his favorite when watching Dynamite cook. "Go ahead and start cooking." And this time, Dynamite actually does. He explains the recipe for the day and the steps he is taking to peel the prawns. He explains the recipe for the day and the steps he's taking to peel the prawns, holding them up as he does so, allowing the viewers to get a good view of each step. The camera zooms in appropriately, really highlighting the skill Dynamite has with his hands. He's very dexterous, and he peels the prawns with ease, separating the parts he wants for the broth and the meat he wants to save for later. He takes a moment to explain all the ingredients that are going to be added to the broth and discusses how long to simmer it down in order to get the most flavor. He talks about bashing open the garlic and lemongrass to really extract as much flavor as possible. It's gruff, but it's also very informative and well explained. He pauses frequently to allow people to keep up with what he's doing and does his best to stand off to the side when dropping ingredients into the pot so that it can be easy for the viewers to see. The chat fills with a lot of personal anecdotes for Tom Yum Soup, but it floods even more with comments appreciating Dynamite and discussing what a good job he does explaining. Any few questions that remain, the other viewers seem to be able to answer easily, and a sudden sense of community is being fostered without Dynamite even knowing that he's doing it. Once everything is in the pot, he turns back to the other ingredients and spends a brief moment explaining what he's going to do to prepare them while the broth simmers. And then, as soon as he's quiet and working, Deku pipes back up. It wasn't that anyone had forgotten he was there, but the last few minutes had been so focused on Dynamite and the recipe that Deku hadn't even been on the screen for a lot of it. It's almost jarring when he speaks up again, but the look on his face tells everyone that he had been patiently waiting for this moment, the taste of revenge clear in his tone. The apron hadn't been enough, it seemed. Deku wanted payback for the playlist, and he had been lying in wait the entire beginning of the episode. "Did you guys know that Kachan used to be afraid of thunderstorms?" he asks in what is clearly meant to be a false sense of innocence. The way his smile stretches across his face is far too big to mistake for anything else. Dynamite's knife clatters loudly against the countertop. "What the hell, Deku?" "The point of this show is for everyone to get to know you, right?" Deku continues with the fake innocence. "I'm just helping with that." Dynamite makes no move to pick his knife back up. There's a brief silence where he's clearly calculating his next move, and then he's grinning, and it's almost as lethal as Deku's fake innocence. Deku still cries when he meets other pro heroes. "I do not!" Deku replies incredulously, his mouth falling open in surprise. "You literally cry, like 2 days ago when those other heroes asked for your autograph." Dynamite replies sharply, moving to grab his knife again. "I didn't cry," Deku retorts, crossing his arms again. It's the most petulant anyone has ever seen him act, and the chat is absolutely eating it up. I was a little choked up. That's all. You're the number one hero, and you get choked up when people want your autograph. Dynamite emphasizes in a way that's clearly meant to be somewhat mocking. You slept with a stuffed animal until middle school. Deku fires back immediately. That's normal. Dynamite defends, putting down the knife he had just picked up. You still have that stuffed animal. Deku tacks on, looking smug. When All Might called you to wish you a happy birthday last year, you were so flustered that you hung up on him. Dynamite retorts, turning to fully face Deku now. Deku swivels in his chair as well, leaving them nearly eye to eye. The only thing is the fact that Deku is sitting, so he's technically tipping his chin up to stare Dynamite down, but it adds air to his defiance. You used to participate in my hero analysis, and you have more All Might comics than I do. You ran away from home once, but it only lasted for 10 minutes because you felt too bad for worrying your mom and went home. It was your idea that I run away from home. Deku stands from his chair, but he's smiling now instead of being angry. Always a bad influence, Kachan. You were too much of a damn wuss to follow through. You barely made it through the door before you were going home again. Dynamite remembers, his own lips twitching up at the corners in a smile. My mom hadn't even started cooking dinner yet. I came back for dinner, though. Deku laughs, all tension draining from his shoulders. Yeah, your stupid ass went home and apologized to your mom and then came back and stayed the night like we planned. Dynamite slumps back against the corner, shaking his head at the memory. My mom didn't even realize I'd run away. Deku admits, grinning a little sheepishly. When I got home, she asked me why I had come home from your house. She knew I was there the whole time. She thought I was just going to spend the night. Jesus! Dynamite laughs. You can't even run away properly. I've never been good at hurting people I care about. Deku replies with a shrug, sliding back into his seat. Dynamite looks like he wants to say something back to that when the pot on the stove behind him starts to boil over, the broth making a distinct sound as it evaporates on the flame. Shit! Dynamite flies off the counter and rushes to the stove, turning the heat down and lifting the lid so he's able to stir it. If you're cooking this at home, don't get distracted by a shitty nerd. It ruins how your food turns out. I don't know, Deku replies mildly. Food is better when enjoyed with good company. I wonder if I'll ever get the chance to find that out. Dynamite remarks, replacing the lid on the pot. The chat had gone absolutely wild at all the revelations of their history, everyone gripping onto different facts and trying to reconcile that with knowledge they already have of the heroes. The most striking thing, though, the thing that catches everyone's attention and refuses to let go, is that the way that they know each other. They talk so casually about each other and their history together. It's like they never spent a minute apart from each other. And while that's highly unlikely, everything they do, every interaction they have, seems to flaunt a bond that a lot of people didn't realize they had. It was one thing for Deku to have talked openly in interviews about their friendship, but it was another thing entirely to watch it unfold right in front of their eyes. Deku talked about a lot of pro heroes, and he had only had great things to say about them, Dynamite included. But this was entirely different than his public persona, or his well-crafted praise of someone. This was real and genuine in a way that no interview could ever be. There was nothing scripted or predictable about the way they interacted. They fed off of each other, bounced their taunts back and forth with absolute ease, each rising to their side of the challenge. But underneath it all was a current of fondness and friendliness that nobody had really ever seen Dynamite display towards anyone. Next step. Dynamite breaks the silence that had settled after his clip. Is to strain the broth. Ideally, you'll strain it twice, just to be sure. He's standing over his kitchen sink, pot holders over his hands, as he clutches the metal stock pot as close to his body as he can tolerate. There's a strainer on the sink, sitting over the opening of a rather large bowl that was clearly meant to catch all the broth. Dynamite struggles with the pot a little bit because it's too big and too hot for him to hold comfortably. He's just gotten it over the sink and lined it up with the strainer and the bowl when Deku leaps out of his chair and rushes across the kitchen. Wait, Kachan! Dynamite pauses just short of tipping the pot and pouring the broth. What? Your sleeves! Deku replies, as if that should answer everything. To Dynamite, it seems to. He glances down at his arms and mumbles some curse under his breath, beginning to try and shift the pot back towards the stove, but Deku reaches his side before he can go any further. I've got him. Dynamite freezes in his spot, twisting to face Deku a little more squarely. Deku steps up to him with the utmost ease, fingers brushing the inside of Dynamite's forearm as he reaches to undo the button holding the cuff of the long sleeve together. He makes quick work of gently rolling the sleeve up, leaning his head forward to catch his work, and nearly putting Dynamite's face into a sea of green curls. His fingers are delicate, but quick, gently gliding up the length of Dynamite's forearm as he pushes the sleeve up past his elbow. Deku's face isn't clearly visible with how he has it tilted down, but Dynamite's face is visible, and it's almost as red as Deku's had been earlier. But he doesn't move to pull away as Deku shifts him to make it easier to reach his other arm. After a moment, Deku finishes, and he steps back to look at his handiwork. He glances up to meet Dynamite's face, and the moment their eyes meet, it's like a tangible spark shifts through the screen. For the long moment that they stare at each other, both as red as the tomato that Dynamite had been cutting up previously, the world seems to stop. Even the chat is completely silent as those seconds tick by, nobody daring to break the tension that has built between them. It's almost hard to breathe, watching the way they simply stare at each other. Finally, Dynamite seems to regain some sense of self and clears his throat. Move, Deku. I've got hot shit in my hands here. Right! Deku nearly jumps back, looking almost as if he'd been electrocuted by the spark that was between them. Sorry, I just didn't want you to get any broth on your sleeves. Dynamite doesn't reply to that as he finally gets around to straining the broth. He strains it twice while Deku shuffles back to his seat. His eyes wide, cheeks still tinted pink. He rests his hand on the counter and seems entirely unaware of the fact that he's opening and closing his fists repeatedly, as if he can't get a sensation off of his fingertips. Dynamite manages to finish making the rest of the soup without much input from Deku. He explains the different spice levels, and this time seems to take pity on Deku, making it at a spice level that he can tolerate instead of too hot for his taste. Deku watches every move Dynamite makes and comments occasionally, but suddenly seems much more subdued than he had been before. The chat is, as expected, having an absolute field day with the entire thing. When the soup is finally done, Dynamite dishes up 3 bowls of it again, beckoning Kotaro onto the screen. The chat is thrilled to see the man since he hadn't had much interaction this episode. They're even more thrilled when Dynamite tells them nonchalantly that he's part of the eating crew now too, and that he would be getting a dish every episode. The episode ends with everyone enjoying their soup. Kotaro raves about how delicious it is. Deku agrees, trying to plaster his usual smile on his face, but it sits a little wonky suddenly. Dynamite smiles confidently, the way he always does. But the last image that shows up on the screen before the episode ends is of Dynamite staring at Deku's profile, eyebrows drawn together, and what appears to be concern. Ascend _NT. Okay. I know I'm not the only person who saw that blush, right? Eye emoji. Violet Wisteria. That was the most domestic thing I've ever witnessed. Did you see how tenderly Deku rolled up his sleeves? Nico-kun. It's amazing that the electricity between them didn't burn down the whole kitchen. Movie Talker. Not Dynamite choosing to actually make it edible for Deku this episode. Crying emoji, hearts emoji. Darth Dutton. The amount of Kotaro content we have gotten is not nearly enough for my liking. Sveti and Mickey. Petition to make Kotaro a permanent part of every episode. Kos Minao, 13. Okay, but did you guys listen to Deku's playlist? Like, half of those songs are about being in love with your best friend. Stultified _ nugget. Yeah, Deku's playlist is pretty fruity, not gonna lie. Eyes emoji. Slady Dyson. Everything about this episode was fruity, not just the playlist. Alchemedes. I bet we get to see Dynamite blush again if we saw him listen to the playlist. BCow111. You guys are thinking what I'm thinking, right? Tell me you also think they're in love. My _pronouns _aren't. If they're not in love, I don't know what love looks like. Star eyes emoji. Loves love. I mean, Dynamite just stood there and let Deku roll up his sleeves. That's about as domestic as possible. Those _ships _ though. Don't worry, guys. I'll find us proof. Freckles _and _flowers. That playlist is full of love songs, and Dynamite says he sings them around the kitchen. Is Deku serenading Dynamite with love songs? Faye Kachan. The idea of Deku serenading Dynamite is actually going to be the thing that kills me. Cloud _cover. Do you think Kotaro knows why he started with this? He must know, right? Izuku sighs as he closes his laptop, dropping his head onto the table before him. He should have known. He did know, honestly, that their fans wouldn't be nearly as unobservant as Katsuki. He knew that they would hone in on his playlist, but he hadn't expected it to be so immediate. The episode had barely finished airing half an hour ago, and they were already in the comments calling him out for having a bunch of love songs in his playlist. He'd played that playlist for Katsuki dozens of times and never heard a word about it, but here the fans were, listening to it once, and already they were finding the hidden words that Izuku used the playlist to say for him. The thing is, he can't even deny that the playlist has some love songs in it. That hadn't been intentional, though. It really hadn't been. He just created a playlist of songs that reminded him of Katsuki and what it felt like to be in the kitchen with him. He hadn't thought twice about it until he'd been listening to it one day while cooking when Ochaka had come over and she asked him why he was listening to love songs. And, well, he couldn't overlook that aspect once it had been pointed out to him. But he also couldn't bring himself to change the songs on the playlist because he had so many fond memories of dancing around Katsuki's kitchen to them. And so he just continued to listen to the same playlist and hoped that Katsuki wouldn't ever notice. And he never had. Which was great, because Izuku wasn't sure how he'd ever explain it if he was asked directly. And for a long time, it seemed like he'd never be directly asked because Katsuki never cared to say anything more than turn that shit off in regards to his music. But now that so many people had heard it, now that so many people had already identified it for what it was, he was going to have to figure out how to explain himself. That, or he was going to have to figure out how to block Katsuki's internet access and blackmail everyone they knew into never mentioning it ever again. He wasn't sure which option was easier. Alright, you guys, that is the end of Chapter 3 of Discriminating Taste. Next episode should be out fairly soon because I am now on Thanksgiving break. But I will see you guys next time. Bye!